Tonight, we ask two questions. 1. How far would you go to defend your home, your family, and your way of life? And 2, how far would you go to keep yourself alive? In 1862, a battle took place between the Apache and the U.S. Army, in which the Apache fought to defend their lands, and the Americans fought to simply not die of thirst in the middle of the desert. Join us now for the brutal true story of the Battle of Apache Pass. Southeastern Arizona, July 15, 1862. As the summer sun reaches its noontime apex, a group of 140 U.S. Army soldiers straggle through a narrow pass in search of a freshwater spring known to be in the area. All of them know that this is a very dangerous place to be, as the Apache, the most feared and powerful tribe in this area, have been known to ambush their enemies in just such a place as this. But the heat is brutal, and these men and their horses are thirsty. If they do not drink soon, they may very well perish. So they continue on, with every sound that echoes off the steep walls of the pass, causing many troopers to flinch nervously, as their eyes continually sweep the hillsides around them. But so far, there has been no sign of the Apache, and the soldiers are almost to the springs. All among them can nearly taste its cold, clear waters finally slaking their thirst. Then, suddenly, the landscape around them explodes in gunfire and war cries. It is the Chiricahua Apache, led by Chief Mangas Coloradas and his son-in-law, Cochise. They have painstakingly planned this ambush, and now it seems that it will result in a great victory against these soldiers whom the Apache refer to as White Eyes. From the vantage point of the Apaches in the hills surrounding the pass, the soldiers appear like a scattering group of prey animals. From the soldiers' vantage point, the Apaches are seemingly everywhere, hundreds of them, and now the soldiers are trapped. The Apache are not only atop the hills to their left and to their right, but they have blocked the soldiers' route to the springs. Their commanding officer, Captain Thomas Roberts, knows that many of his men are already on the verge of dying of thirst, and that a retreat back across the parched desert will likely kill many of them. Thus, his order goes out. The men will stay and fight. But the arrows and bullets raining down upon them soon prove to be too much for them to hold their position, and Roberts orders the men to move back towards the entrance of the pass. With every passing minute, it seems more and more likely to Mangas Coloradas and Cochise that their plan has in fact worked. Mangas Coloradas, or Red Sleeves, was given his name by another long-time Apache enemy, the Mexicans. Born in 1795, he had risen to this position via hard combat and steadfast leadership. Standing roughly 6'6", Mangus is much taller than his contemporaries and has risen to prominence via his fearsome, fearless conduct in the ongoing wars the Apache fought with the Americans, the Mexicans, the Spanish, and rival tribes such as the Navajo and the Comanche. In 1837, his predecessor had been murdered by Mexican bandits and scalped in order to reap the bounty the Mexican government had offered for Apache scalps. Mangus's first order of business as a newly appointed chief was to wreak absolute havoc upon the perpetrators of the murder, raiding Mexican settlements and farms throughout the territories of what was then northern Mexico. He had joined with another Apache chief named Cuchillo Negro, or Black Knife, in order to effectively hold the entire town of Santa Rita hostage, after some of their silver miner citizenry had killed a number of Apache. The Apache's disdain for the Mexican government ran so deep that in 1846, during the Mexican-American War, the Apache promised American troops safe passage on their way south to battle Santa Anna's army. In the 1850s, tensions had continued to rise between the Americans and the Apache, culminating in smaller-scale engagements like the 1854 Battle of Ojo Caliente, in which the Army had engaged a band of roughly 150 Apache warriors, killing 5 and wounding 6. But still, Mangus, now around 70 years old, had sought to let prudence be the better part of valor, and had argued and worked for some kind of agreeable peace with the Americans. Though still a revered and fearsome war chief, he had seen enough death and suffering in his time to seek to avoid it whenever possible. But in December of 1860, a group of 30 miners had attacked a small Apache camp, killing 4 warriors, wounding several others, and taking 13 women and children prisoner. This would prove to be the final straw for Mangas Coloradas, and the imposing chief would, from then on, conduct his raiding upon the Americans with as much voracity as he had against the Mexicans. In 1860, one of Mangus's daughters, Dos Tese, married a promising young warrior who had managed to garner the approval of her legendary father. This warrior was Cochise. In early 1861, Cochise and a band of young warriors had been falsely accused by a local army official of kidnapping a 12-year-old boy. The boy had, in fact, been taken by another group of Apaches belonging to the Coyotero band, but the prevailing sentiment amongst the officers was that Cochise and his men were guilty, if not of this particular crime, then certainly of some other. In their efforts to arrest him, the commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Morrison, had ordered Lieutenant George Bascom to take his men into the Chiricahua Mountains and to kill or capture any Apache they could find, by any means necessary. But, realizing that it would be next to impossible to hunt the Apache down in their own territory, Bascom had instead resorted to inviting Cochise and his followers to a supposedly peaceful meeting. Cochise, living far away from both the ranch where the attack had occurred and from the homelands of the Coyotero Apache, had no knowledge that the attack had even occurred, and was under the impression that this was to be a meeting to speak about coming to peace with the U.S. government. In fact, he had felt so assured of his safety that he had come to the meeting with his brother, 2 of his nephews, his wife, and 2 children. This would prove to be a dire mistake. Under a flag of truce, Bascom would invite Cochise into his tent, under the auspices that they would discuss the possibility for peace between their 2 peoples. But once they were inside the tent, Bascom immediately began to accuse Cochise of kidnapping the young boy. Cochise, having no knowledge that the attack had even occurred, vehemently denied any involvement in the incident. But Bascom did not believe him. And, in short order, 2 guards moved to arrest and detain Cochise. In response to this, the Apache warrior quickly pulled his knife and slashed open the back wall of the tent, diving through the hole and running in a zigzag pattern to avoid the soldiers' gunfire before escaping into the hills. But while Cochise had evaded arrest, Bascom still had custody of his brother, his nephews, and his wife and 2 children. In retaliation, Cochise had quickly organized a series of raids and taken hostages of his own. He had hoped to use these hostages to bargain for the release of his family, but although his wife and children would later be released, Bascom would refuse to negotiate for the release of Cochise's brother and nephews, all of whom would eventually be executed by hanging. In retaliation for this, several of Cochise's captives were killed as well, reportedly via torturous ends, being stabbed or roasted alive. These events, known to history as the Bascom Affair, would cause a complete breakdown in relations between the U.S. and the Apache. Throughout the spring of 1862, Cochise, Mangas Coloradas, and their warriors had raided the surrounding countryside relentlessly. Countless homesteads were destroyed, and countless numbers of settlers in remote areas met horrific ends at the hands of the Apache. But as the raiding intensified, the U.S. Army was less and less capable of pursuing and engaging the Apache. This was due to the ongoing American Civil War, which now engulfed the attention of the entire nation. While much of the fighting was taking place east of the Mississippi, the war did in fact spill all the way into the American Southwest. In fact, it is the entire reason that these U.S. Army troops have come to Apache Pass in the first place. They are on a march eastward, intent on driving Confederate forces out of the territory. In fact, Just prior to beginning their march towards Apache Pass, they had driven Confederate forces from the city of Tucson without a shot being fired. But in their pursuit of the Confederates, U.S. Army officers had sought out these springs at Apache Pass as a waypoint at which to slake their men's thirst and to provide a respite from their incessant, exhaustive desert march. These soldiers, comprised of 116 troops from the 1st California Infantry and 22 cavalrymen from the 2nd California Cavalry, have already marched hundreds of miles, with hundreds more to go. They are, in fact, a scouting party sent out in advance of the main force in order to reconnoiter the location and determine the suitability of the watering hole for a force of nearly 2,000 men who have remained behind at nearby Dragoon Springs. Now, they find themselves fighting against an Apache force that outnumbers them nearly 2 to 1, and also occupies the high ground all around them. But for all that the soldiers lack in numbers and tactical position, their one hope lies in their superior firepower. In addition to their infantry and cavalrymen, they have also brought with them 2 mountain howitzer field cannons. These cannons, carried in segments on the backs of 3 to 4 mules, could rapidly be assembled and brought to bear against enemy forces. Though not as large as traditional field cannons, they are far more mobile and adaptable to quick use in battle. Now, with the center of Apache Pass appearing more and more like a certain death trap, Captain Roberts orders his men to retreat to the mouth of the pass and make ready the howitzers. With bullets and arrows raining down all around them, the artillery crew hurriedly works to assemble and load the artillery weapons, as their comrades in arms provide covering fire against the Apache warriors that they are scarcely able to see. Finally, though, the howitzers are loaded, and Roberts orders the first volley against the Apache to be unleashed. With a cacophonous roar, the howitzers fire. But with the Apaches ensconced high up on the hillsides surrounding them, this first attempt proves to be futile, as the angle is too steep for the howitzers to reach their targets. The first 2 12-pound cannonballs simply slam into the ground well below the Apache. But the troops, knowing that these howitzers are now their only hope of getting out of Apache Pass alive, hurriedly reposition the cannons, moving them even farther back towards the entrance of the pass. Moments later, another roar rings out from the howitzers, and this time, 2 Apache positions are hit directly. For the Apache, this is the first time they have seen the howitzers in use. While they have seen the use of field artillery by the Spanish and the Mexicans in the preceding decades, artillery of this power and mobility is something altogether new and undoubtedly unsettling. But these warriors, fighting under the revered leadership of both Mangas Coloradas and Cochise, and intent on exacting their revenge upon the Americans, refused to retreat from their positions. And so, for the remainder of the afternoon and nearly until the sun has fully set, the fighting continues, with the Army soldiers pouring artillery fire into the Apache ranks, and the Apache moving from position to position behind the rocks and crags of the hills, taking shots at the soldiers whenever an opportunity arose. Finally, though, as darkness falls over the desert, the Apache disappear into the landscape, leaving the exhausted, thirsty, and hungry soldiers to finally have access to the waters of Apache Springs. As the moon rises, Captain Roberts cautiously allows his men to advance to the spring, and finally, when it seems as though the Apache have indeed retired from the fight, he allows his men to drink from the springs and to enjoy a meal in the cool of the night. The next morning, before Captain Roberts and his men are able to move out and head back to the main contingent of Army soldiers at Dragoon Springs, Mangas Coloradas, Cochise, and their Apache warriors again line the hillsides surrounding the pass. But this time, loath to endure another prolonged and costly fight, they soon meld into the rocks and hillsides again, retiring from the fight for good and returning to their camp to reorganize and refit for another chance at the Americans. Captain Roberts and his men will reach Dragoon Springs later this evening and report their narrow escape to their unnerved comrades, who now realize that the ongoing Civil War is no longer the only conflict they will have to worry about. In the end, 2 American soldiers would be killed and 2 wounded, as well as roughly 10 Apache killed and an unknown number wounded. This battle, what will come to be known to history as the Battle of Apache Pass, marks a true escalation in the war between the U.S. Army and the Apache people, one that will carry on for decades to come. This war will result in some of the most brutal fighting in American history, with countless lives lost on both sides. For their parts, Mangas Coloradas and Cochise will pass into legend as 2 of the most important leaders in the history of the Apache tribe. However, neither of their roads will be easy. In 1863, Mangus will be killed by American soldiers in a horrific incident marred by deception, cruelty, and an unnerving fascination with the macabre. For his part, Cochise will go on to fight the Army for another decade, before ultimately retiring to the short-lived Chiricahua Reservation in Arizona, where he died of natural causes in 1874. But the countless legendary exploits of both Mangas Coloradas and Cochise, as well as the countless battles fought in the decades-long war between the U.S. Army and the Apache, are far too numerous to cover in one episode. For tonight, those are other stories for other times. Thank you for joining us on this episode of History at the OK Corral. If you like this story, click on one of the videos on your screen now to watch more. Also, if you'd like to learn more about Old West history, be sure to sign up for the HOKC newsletter. Link is in the description below. Thank you again for watching, and we'll see you next time on History at the OK Corral, home of history's greatest shootouts and showdowns.